Well, creating a pipeline that copies data from one place to another is a pretty useful thing to be able to do and something that we do quite regularly. But quite often you want to have some kind of transformation happening to the data as you move it from one place to another. So you might want to have a pipeline that has multiple activities, one just simply to copy the data, but others to go and do some computational logic against that data and transform it. And one of the ways we might want to do that is using Hive in a Hadoop cluster. So let's take a look at how we can do that using a Hadoop cluster in HD Insight from within an Azure Data Factory pipeline. So here I am in Visual Studio, and I'm creating a pipeline. So I have the usual kind of components. I've got some linked services here. I've got my blob store, which is where my source data is that I'm going to be copying. And that source data, we'll take a look at it in a minute, but it's going to be some web server log files that I'm going to copy. And I have a SQL database where I'm going to write the results of my processing. So I'm basically going to take my web server logs, I'm going to summarize them, and I'm going to write the output to this database. Now the cluster itself is, we're going to use an HD Insight cluster that has Hadoop installed in it to do the processing. And you can see that what I've done here is I've created something called an HDI cluster. This is of type HD Insight on demand. So in other words, I don't already have an HD Insight cluster in place. This is going to be generated automatically for me. So what's going to happen is my pipeline, whenever it needs the cluster, is going to create one. It'll provision an HD Insight cluster. And that'll take 20 minutes to half an hour to actually provision. Then it will run the job. And then after 5 minutes of an activity here, time to live 5 minutes, it will then get rid of the cluster so that I'm not paying for it while I'm not using it. It's just bringing it up when it's needed, using it, and then deleting it. It's going to do that. It's going to bring up an HD Insight cluster. I'm going to be running Linux in that cluster. And it's going to be linked to my blob store. That's where the HD Insight cluster will store its various bits of data in that storage account. So those are the various services I'm going to use. The various data sets that are going to be involved in all of this. Well, there's the source data itself, which looks like this. It's a text file that contains columns of date, time, the client IP address, the client username, the server IP address, the server port, the method, whether it's a post or whatever type of GET request that is in there, the URI stem, so in other words, the URL that's been requested, the query string that was passed with that, and so on. So all the sorts of things I would find in a web server log, basically. And it's going to read that from the Azure Blob Store, from my Blob Store location, in this location here. So it's going to be in the year and month folder. We'll have a folder with the year, a folder with the month, and it's going to get a monthly log file from each of those locations. It'll be a text file, and it will be space delimited, and it's partitioned by that year and month. So depending on when the activity is running, it's going to look for the current year, the current month, and it's going to read the data. So it's going to be available every month. We're going to have a monthly log file that gets put there by the web server. And that might be written by a technology like Flume or something like that, or we might just have some process that copies our web server logs to that Azure storage location. Now we're going to read that, and then we're going to use HD Insight to summarize that data. So that summary is going to be producing results that look like this. We're going to have the log date, the number of requests that were given on that date, the number of bytes in, and the number of bytes out on that date. And that's going to be stored in a location that looks like this. It's going to be summary year equals, and then whatever the year is, month equals, and then month whatever the year is, and again partitioned by year and month. And the way that that's going to get generated, if I have a look in my dependencies here, I've got this HiveQL script here, which is going to run the script for every slice, every activity window. We're going to drop the tables if they already exist. We're going to create a table called raw logs, which is based on my data that I'm reading from my log file. And I'm going to store that as a text file. It's going to store it in my log folder. These are parameters that are going to be passed in. And then we're going to go ahead and skip the first 4 lines because that contains all the header information in my log file. And we're going to terminate the fields by space. So that's how it reads the data. We then create a table called log summary, which is partitioned by year and month, which is why we've got that syntax here, year equals year, month equals month. That's how Hive partitions tables. It creates folders that are literally called year equals and then whatever the year is, and then month equals whatever the month is. So we'll create a partition table using Hive. that is going to have the fields that we want. And then we're going to insert into that by using this select statement. So we're just basically summarizing the data by counting the number of records, that's the number of requests, summing the number of bytes in and out as the input out and output bytes, and the year and the month are basically the year and the month of the log date from the log file, and that's how we partition the data for year and month. So we're going ahead and using that Hive script to process the data and summarize it effectively, and that gives us our data set that looks like this. And then we're going to pick that up and we're going to write that to our database. So we have a table in our database called Hive logs, DBO Hive logs, in our Azure SQL database, which has the log date, the requests, the bytes in and bytes out. And the table itself is called dbo.hivelogs. And if I go and have a look at my Azure SQL database and just actually go and query that table just now, we'll do a select star from dbo.hivelogs. And you can see those are the columns that are in that table. There currently isn't any data in there. The table's currently empty. So we're going to then create a pipeline that hooks all of these things together. And when I look at my pipeline in Visual Studio, I can actually see there's a map of that pipeline, and I can see there's two activities. We'll just zoom into that so we can see it a bit more clearly. But this pipeline consists of a data set here that's my source Hive log data. Then I've got a Hive script that's going to summarize it. That's my first activity. And then I've got an output from that activity. That's my Hive summary. That's going to be a data set that I then pick up from the next activity in my pipeline, which is going to copy that summarized data to SQL, and it's going to write into the Hive logs table. So I can see my pipeline with two activities in there working with these data sets. If I actually go and take a look at the JSON that defines that pipeline, I can see here are the activities. The first one is of type HD Insight Hive. So it's going to go and run that Hive QL script that we're going to have there. That's then going to have a number of parameters that are passed into it. These are the Hive configuration settings that we saw in there. So there's the folder, which is the location where the source data is. So that's the IIS logs folder in my storage account. There's the summary folder, which is where we're going to write the results of that. So that's going to be, again, in my storage account, the IIS logs summary subfolder. And then we have the year and month, which are passed in as parameters as well. So we're just going to format the year and the month from whatever the start of the activity window is, whatever that slice start date time is. So we'll run that. The input is my Hive IIS log txt data set. So that's my text file containing the source data. The output is the Hive summary file. So that's what's going to get written out. And it's going to go and run that. We've got a concurrency level of 2, so we'll have 2 of these things running at a time, and that's going to run on a monthly basis. Now that's the Hive script that summarizes the log. The second action, or the second activity that I have in my pipeline is called copy. It's a copy activity where I'm going to take my data from a blob source and write it to a SQL sync, and I'm going to map the log date to log date, request to request, bytes in to bytes in, and bytes out to bytes out, as you would expect. The input for that is my Hive summary, and the output of that is my DBO Hive log. So again, just using those data sets that I've defined. And again, it's going to go and copy those summarized logs. So we've got that as a scheduled pipeline, and we're ready to go and run that. So we'll just go and publish that to our existing Azure Data Factory. We don't need to remove any of the existing objects, so we'll just go and click Next. And it's going to go in and validate all of those different JSON documents, upload them, and register them in my Azure Data Factory, and then it's going to start the pipeline. All of that's been uploaded. We've now got the pipeline registered, and I can click Finish on the wizard here. And if I go and return to my portal and just have a look in my Azure Data Factory here, I can take a look at my pipelines, and I can see that I have a summarized logs Hive pipeline, which is currently running. And if I go and take a look at my monitor and manage tool here, and I can see there's the summarized logs use SQL pipeline, but there's actually a summarized logs Hive pipeline. That's the pipeline that we've just deployed. And it doesn't show any activity windows for that, but if I go and filter for the dates that the web server logs are actually therefore, so they start on the 1st of January 2016 at 0000 hours. So we'll just start our interval there, and we'll take a look until the end of July. Move that slider so that we're at the end of that day. Apply that filter. I can see a whole bunch of activity windows there. I'm just going to filter by pipeline so that we're only looking at the ones for our summarize logs Hive pipeline. And I can see that I've got a whole bunch of things that I've got an in process here, or in progress HD Insight. Now these are going to run, they're going to take a little while to run because for each of these slices we're going to provision HD Insight. So it'll go ahead and provision it if it's not already there, and then it will use the HD Insight cluster, and that takes about 20 minutes to run. So we'll just leave that running and we'll come back and check on it thanks to the magic of video editing in just a few seconds. And after 20 minutes or so, the HD Insight cluster has been provisioned, and I can see that the activity windows for January and February are now complete, and we've started on the March and April activity windows. So we've been able to spin up that HD Insight cluster on demand and use it to process the data. And if I now go back across here, and we'll just close that window and take a look in our Hive logs table again, I can see that that summarized data has been copied across into my Azure SQL database table ready for me to do my reporting or my analysis of. So what we've seen here is that we can create a pipeline, in this case the summarize logs pipeline here, which consists of multiple activities, and those activities, in this case we used a Hive query to go and run in my HD Insight cluster. And we've used that to summarize the data, and then a second activity to copy the output from that first activity and place that into our Azure SQL database.